Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are zooming in from. Welcome to our webinar series. First of all, I'd like to remind you that this presentation is being recorded and hold on a second. Please mute yourself for a second. Thank you. All right, I'd just like to remind you that this is being recorded and that for those of you who have registered for it, the recording will be available afterwards, and there will be a time for questions at the end of her presentation. Okay, so, and feel free to put that in the chat as well. Okay, so now what I would like to do is I just like to introduce our speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Galante, our second speaker in this year's webinar series. Dr. Galante is an assistant professor of language education and Tesol in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill University. Growing up in Brazil, a Portuguese-speaking country, and in a family with Italian and speaking heritage, mixing languages has always been the norm for her. At school, she learned English, Esperanto, Tupi, Italian, Spanish, and Latin. So Dr. Galante has developed an extensive career as an English language teacher, coordinator, theater director, and teacher educator. With these experiences, Dr. Galante has been navigating through her multiple identities as a language learner, teacher, international student, immigrant, and plurilingual speaker. So it is only fitting that her research focuses on language teacher and learner empowerment and on the effects of plurilingual and translingual approaches on student learning. And at McGill, it is notable that she's also the director of the Plurilingual Lab. So without further ado, let's please welcome Dr. Galante.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. It's very nice to be here. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I'm going to ask people to mute your microphones just so there is no interference. Oops. Sorry, let me start sharing my screen again because I forgot to put the sound. Just 1 second. Okay, is everybody able to hear me and to see me?
Yep.
Yes, great. All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. The title of my presentation is Plurilingual and Translanguaging Approaches in the Language Classroom, and what does classroom research show about benefits and challenges? So as Joanna has already introduced me, my name is Angelica Galante. I am based at McGill University. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Ganyagehaga. And we recognize and respect the Ganyagehaga as the traditional custodians of these lands and waters that we meet today. And I'm based in Montreal, which is actually Tiohtià:ke, the city where many First Nations meet, and we are happy to gather here. So just an overview of the outline, I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the notion of the repertoire. Then we're going to be taking a look at plurilingual and translanguaging approaches in the language classrooms. I'm going to introduce 3 studies in different settings. All of the studies are in Tesol, but also in other languages. I'm going to be highlighting the main benefits and challenges of these approaches, provide samples of tasks and resources, so those of you who are teachers might want to be interested in that. And finally, a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So Joanna has already introduced me, so you already know a little bit of myself. Eu sou brasileira, I'm from Brazil. I identify as a Latina. I have Spanish and Italian heritage, and as Joanna has mentioned, growing up with multiple languages was the norm for me and continues to be the norm because I still use multiple languages on a day-to-day. I am based in Canada, but my family is in Brazil, so I use Portuguese quite often, Spanish as well, French now here in Montreal. I have 27 years of experience in language teaching as a whole, both in Brazil and Canada, as an English teacher, pedagogical coordinator, university English instructor. The languages in my repertoire, of course, fluctuate. I don't speak all of these languages fluently, but that's normal because of the experiences that we have. And what I do, I am a professor, a researcher, an educational consultant, a language teacher, an educator, curriculum designer, and also a language learner. And I think I will always be a language learner, not only with the languages that I already speak, but also new languages that I am willing to learn. So on that note, I'm going to share you one profile of a student that participated in one of the research studies that I have conducted. So this is Zuko. He was here in Canada as an international student. He came from Ecuador, and he had just been admitted into an English-speaking university, but his IELTS scores were not high enough to get into direct entry. So he was enrolled in an English for academic purposes course to enhance the levels of English. But of course, Zuko is not only an English language learner. He has Quechua heritage. He spoke Ecuadorian Spanish. He also spoke English very well already. He had knowledge of French, and he was willing to learn Mandarin. Now, in the classroom, if we do not allow students to share their linguistic profiles, all we're going to see is this person is an English language learner. Or in the Tesol industry that we have internationally, we have this English-only approach where we see the student as an English learner, and we are there to provide English language teaching for these students. However, these students are much more than that, and they have way more knowledge about not only languages, but also cultures that need to be enhanced and valued in the language classroom. So this notion of the repertoire is not new. We are at a time in applied linguistics where we are at a multi or plural turn, which requires an inclusive and integrated view of language. So language is not only English only, it is a repertoire of not only languages, but varieties, semiotic resources, multimodality, and lived experiences. And of course, as integrated, this repertoire is always fluctuating. Sometimes we use resources from one language or another, or from one experience or another, or an emotion that triggers, a language rather than another. So all of these experiences are valued in the language classroom, not only TESOL, but other language classrooms as well. So I would like you to think about this notion of the repertoire, because this is going to be one common theme in all the studies that I'm going to show you today. Now, two approaches that are very in line with the plural and multi turn in applied linguistics are plurilingualism and translanguaging. And you may have already heard about these two approaches. And there are many people who still don't know what is plurilingualism, what is translanguaging, are they the same, are they different? Of course, many scholars have already written about both. And they have highlighted differences and similarities. And I'm going to just share some of the people and the books that we have seen over the past 20, 30 years in these two areas, in plurilingualism and translanguaging. So these two approaches are not new. They have been in place for decades. So it's really important that we not only update ourselves in our own training, but also be open to new developments, because they are developing all the time and very rapidly. Now, some of the similarities, translanguaging and plurilingualism, they emerged as a concept in Europe. They have theoretical and pedagogical underpinnings. They both reject this monolingual ideology, or to see the student simply as an English language learner, and they value and enhance students' repertoires. So both approaches really agree on that. Now, there are a few differences in terms of when they emerged. Plurilingualism emerged in the Council of Europe as a language policy. The Council of Europe is a leading international organization for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in Europe. And translanguaging emerged as a pedagogical practice in the bilingual classroom with English and Welsh. So it was more a bottom-up approach when it emerged. And plurilingualism may be seen as a top-down approach because of policy, but it all comes down to how it is implemented. So both have been implemented in many countries, not only in Canada or the US, in many different types of programs as well. Although translanguaging has a very high popularity in the US, mainly because of the English and Spanish bilingual programs. Both agree with the notion of repertoire. One difference perhaps is that plurilingualism feel that the naming languages is something important. So I was naming all the languages in my repertoire, for example, whereas translanguaging, not that it doesn't agree with naming languages, but it may see the repertoire as sometimes we don't even know which languages that we are using. So it might be all integrated. It's so integrated that sometimes it's not that it's confusing, but it's a repertoire, right? So it's integrated. Now, both have received some criticism as well, as usually new concepts do. Plurilingualism has received some criticism as being top-down directives from policy, which may reinforce neoliberal practices. And with risk of being uncritical if policy is taken up with little evaluation of the context and the language user. So these are two important cautions here that we should take in mind. Translanguaging has been criticized as well because not naming languages can have detrimental effects to minoritized language learners, even erase the minoritized languages. And also translanguaging has been criticized for having claims of being the only approach for social justice in education. Now, with criticisms, of course, it's important to keep them in mind so that we can move forward, and do better and better in the future. So what I would suggest when implementing either plurilingualism or translanguaging, it is important to keep in mind that neoliberal forces are there and they can marginalize multilingual speakers. So we always have to be very aware of them and examine them. Prioritize a bottom-up linguistic practice of our students. Strive to shift dynamics of privilege by empowering students' repertoires. And also naming minoritized languages in students' repertoires for further recognition. Now, I use plurilingual pedagogies here as an umbrella term. It's an umbrella term that has several types of approaches, and I'm not the only one who has implemented plurilingual pedagogies. It may be taken up differently depending on the context, depending on the approach, depending on the program, the students, but I'm going to give you an overview of some of the practices that we have. So we have languaging, which is really talking about language as you are learning. Translanguaging, which we are already familiar with, which is using the fluid linguistic repertoire as you are learning not only language, but content. Cross-linguistic approaches, which is comparing the languages and taking a look at the linguistic items of the languages for further learning. Cross-cultural and intercultural approaches. And here, of course, we have the cultural that is it's a very important dimension in plurilingual pedagogy. Intercomprehension, which is trying to understand a language, even though you have never learned that language just by using your repertoire. So an example is, if I speak Portuguese, it's easier for me to try to understand French, for example. Linguistic landscaping, which is taking a look at the languages in the landscape or in society where you are located. Translation for mediation. Pluriliteracies, which is not only language, but also other types of literacies, such as digital. And multimodality, which is different types of modes of languages, which is one example is sign languages, which is a different modality of language. It's not only oral. Now I'm going to share 3 studies in different settings. The first one is an EAP program in a university in Toronto in Canada. EAP stands for English for Academic Purposes. The second study is in Tesol Teacher Education Program here in Montreal in Canada. And the third study is an EFL program. I call this EFL because that's how it is used in the literature. English is a foreign language program in São Paulo in Brazil. So those of you who are located in different areas, of course, I have two studies here in Canada, but one of them is in São Paulo. So you might be able to see differences and similarities with your context as well. Now, study number one was a study that I conducted in a university in Toronto. I recruited 7 teachers, 7 English language teachers and their students. So there were 129 students. And this was a quasi-experimental study. So what does that mean? The 7 teachers taught 2 different groups of students. So each teacher had their students already. They were teaching 2 groups of students. So I asked each teacher to use different approaches with these 2 groups of students. One was going to be using English-only tasks, and the other one would be using plurilingual tasks. So I call them 2 different groups, English-only group and plurilingual group. English only would be the monolingual group, and the other one would be the plurilingual group. Now, at the time of data collection, these teachers did not know about the approach. So they implemented the approach knowing that it would be something exciting, something different, something that would benefit the students, but they were not necessarily aware of what the plurilingual approach would be. So I really thank the teachers because they really trusted me that we would be doing something very interesting. So there were 79 students in the plurilingual group and 50 students in the English-only group. Now, what were these tasks? All of these tasks are available in the website Breaking the Invisible Wall. So if you're interested in looking at the tasks, I don't have time to explain all of them, but I can give you an overview of what the tasks are. So there were 10 tasks for each group. Here I'm showing only the plurilingual tasks. I'm not going to show the monolingual tasks because they are tasks that we are already used to seeing in books and in other materials. But as you can see, we have linguistic and cultural landscape, an exploration of the linguistic landscape. We have idioms in different languages. Task number 3, for example, here it says code switching, but it's actually translanguaging. Intercomprehension, intercultural encounters, plurilingual communication, and etc. So just to give you an overview, the materials that the teachers were using in the classroom had those dimensions of plurilingual pedagogies in their repertoire. So one simple video, for example, that was shown was of these 2 groups of people using languages fluidly. So I'm just going to show you, this is a 1-minute video, and let's see if that works.
Could you do this to me?
Steven, what is wrong?
My girlfriend just broke up with me.
It's okay. Old man lose horse.
What?
You know, 塞翁失马. There once was an old man who really cherished his horse. It was his best friend. And one day, so you know, it was a blessing in disguise.
Hey Dad. Yeah, నేను ఇప్పుడు ఇక్కడ స్టీవెన్ తోటి ఉన్నా. ఇప్పుడే అయిపోయింది. కానీ చాలా బోరింగ్. వాళ్ళు మా కోసం అని వంట వండినరు కానీ smelled so bad. Just ew. Okay, bye.
Oh, hi Maddie, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing good. Oh, have you met my friend Joseph before?
No, I have not.
Joseph.
My name is Maddie, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Actually, he's a Korean major.
Oh, really?
You're Korean,
You
right?
speak Korean?
네, 저 작년에 한국에 살았어요.
한국말 진짜 잘 알아요. 몇 년생이에요?
저 93년생이에요.
나도.
진짜?
우리 친구할 수 있겠다.
진짜? 우리 밤에 하자.
All right, so in this video, of course, you have seen people using different languages and sometimes not only different languages, but concepts. For example, in the first one, old man lose horse, which is a concept that if you just translate, it's not going to make sense to an English speaker who is not familiar with Mandarin, for example, and how idioms are used in that language. So something that is very important in plurilingual pedagogy is to really make students aware of not only the language, but how the language is used depending on the cultural background. And to just a simple translation cannot really do the job. So here is one example of a task that was used. Part of the curriculum in the EAP program was that students would learn idioms. And not in different languages, but here it was, English idioms was introduced, but in a way that students would explore their entire repertoire of different idioms or different languages. So the students were shown, for example, a warm-up exercise to just get them to think about idioms in other languages and dialects, not only in English, but also in English, of course, because that's the language that they were learning. And then there was a guessing game with several idioms here, and students were supposed to look at the idiom and try to guess the meaning. So of course here, sometimes if you take a rain check, people would think about rain and then check, oh, what does that mean? Literally, it doesn't make any sense. But it was interesting to see the students going through the process of trying to make meaning of an idiom, even if they didn't know what that idiom meant. Because then they would think about if that particular idiom, after they saw that, oh, to take a rain check is to refuse an offer or an invitation, they were also asked to think about, do you have this idiom in the languages that you speak? If you do, how is that idiom written up? Because sometimes you do have the concept, but the words that are used for that particular idiom are going to be different. So this was a very interesting activity so that students could think about the concept, make meaning of the concept, and through the meaning, get the language. And later, they were encouraged to do a role play where they would be using idioms not only in English, but also in the languages that they spoke. And the other students in class would be able to try to identify the idiom that they were using, not only in English, but also in other languages by the use of the body, the way they express themselves. So here, once again, we are thinking about the repertoire, not only with language, but also using the body, the emotion. So sometimes you are able to understand what that means just by using other semiotic resources. Another task that was used was a plurilingual identity, where students were asked to draw themselves on a piece of paper and think about all the languages and the cultures that they have experienced throughout their lives, whether it's from heritage, from policy, from where they live, upbringing, languages they're interested in, places they have been to, and put all this on a piece of paper and then talk about their identity in English, but also using other languages to other classmates. So do you remember Zuko at the very beginning of the talk? So Zuko is one student. He's from Ecuador, and this is his language portrait. He put English in his head, then he has Ni hao in his mouth, Francais, Español, Quechua, and Italian. And he says, Español is on my head because it's my mother language. English, it's on my heart. Español is on my heart. English is on my head because I have to think in English. And Ni hao on my mouth because this will be the next language in the future. So it's important to mention here that in this study, approximately 85% of the participants were from China. And we had students from Ecuador, Turkey, Russia, Korea, Taiwan as well. So because there were the majority was actually Chinese, these students was very interested in learning a little bit of Mandarin so that he could communicate with his peers as well. Now, this was a study that took 4 months. So students had 4 months of instruction. There were 7 instruments used, and the instruments are listed here. It was a mixed methods approach, quasi-experimental in the sense that I used pre-tests and post-tests. So tests at the very beginning, at the very end, to see if there were any differences. And it was a concurrent design. So I'm going to focus mainly on Learner Diaries, Plurilingual and Pluricultural Competence Scale, and a vocabulary test that was used. So the vocabulary test was used at time 2 at the very end with both groups. So it's very important to mention that both groups received the same input of language. For example, they learned the same words, the same vocabulary, the same idiom, but in different approaches. So at time 2, it was expected that both groups would have learned those words. And I also use the Ppc scale. The Ppc scale is a scale that I have designed for the purposes of this study. There are items where students have to agree or disagree. And this has to do with the linguistic and cultural practices that they use on a day-to-day basis. So for example, item number 1, when talking to someone who knows the same languages as I do, I feel comfortable switching between one language to another language. So if they agree, they would score number 4, strongly agree. And the higher the score, the higher the Ppc score for that particular student. So I measured at time 1 to see whether both groups had high or low Ppc scores, and at time 2 to see if the instruction, the plurilingual instruction, actually had an effect on Ppc scores. So what were the main benefits? The Learner Diaries, there were over 600 entries that I analyzed. So the students wrote about every single task that they received, and they talked about very openly, what did you think about this task? Did this help you in any learning, and what was it? And there were a lot of things that they talked about. So I'm going to show you a summary of what they talked about. So there were 9 main affordances, and here you can see how many times it was identified in the data. The first one was cognition. So the process of really thinking about the language made students really reflect and learn the particular word or expression or the language through cognitive processes. Awareness of plurilingual and pluricultural identity. Many students saw themselves as a pure Chinese student, for example, but by the time of the end of the course, they felt that they were way more than that. Not that they were rejecting their Chinese identity, but they were recognizing their Chinese identity and also their heritage, languages from parents or grandparents, and also the new languages that they were learning. Flexible language use, for example, code switching and translanguaging, was by far a very good affordance here. Language and cultural learning, not only English, but other languages. Critical awareness of societal multilingualism and multiculturalism through the linguistic landscaping, they were able to see that. Of course, English language learning, because this was an English program. Empathy, relatability, and criticality. And I'm going to go over just a few comments from students so you can see what that really means. So this is one example. The student talked about how they use different words differently in different languages. So for example, using please, could you, do you mind when they are talking to a professor here in Canada. In Chinese, they have something similar, but they have different words to express that. So learning these different words and trying to connect with other languages that they already knew, they felt that this enhanced language learning, and they were able to remember that because they were connecting that to their lived experiences. Another one, students were learning the language and the cultural components of other students as well. So some students talked about, oh, I've also learned some words in Chinese and other languages from my students. I felt that I was really smart because I could also teach a little bit of my languages to other students as well. Critical awareness of multilingualism, multiculturalism. Some students talked about learning about racism, learned about the history of colonization, and knowing that racism is also part of the culture here in Canada. Canada is not exempt from being a racist society, unfortunately. So it's also important that the students were aware of that, especially because a vast majority of the students in that class comes from a racialized background. So they were Chinese, or they were, visible minorities in Canada, although they were a majority in that particular classroom. Relatability and empathy. Here there is an exchange of a Chinese student talking to an Ecuadorian student who was using the word chino, which is a Spanish word to represent a Chinese male person. But the student was using the word chino to the Chinese student, and the Chinese student felt that that was not an appropriate word to be called, because chino has a negative connotation that is racist for him, but not for the Ecuadorian, because we use this word in Spanish. So for him, he was just using chino, like, well, hey, chino. But that is a very racist word, depending on who you're talking to, and also the context. So in the end, after they had a conversation, the Chinese student said, oh, my friend felt really bad for doing that, but he learned and he will not do that again in the future. Whether he won't do it or not, we cannot control, but hopefully this was a learning moment. Now, were there any changes in Ppc scores between the groups and over time? So yes, there was. So you see here at time 1, the students in the plurilingual group and the English only group, they had very similar scores. But at time 2, the students in the plurilingual group had much higher scores, indicating that the plurilingual tasks did have an effect on how they saw themselves with their plurilingual and pluricultural competence, which is really promising. Now, in terms of vocabulary, I took a look at only 3 tasks and what students talked about those 3 tasks, and also the translanguaging tasks. There were 3 translanguaging tasks for vocabulary, and I wanted to see whether the students would learn the vocabulary through the translanguaging tasks. So at the end of the course, the students who took the translanguaging tasks also had higher scores in vocabulary compared to the students who learned the same words, but not in a translanguaging way. Of course, here I cannot really say for sure it was because of translanguaging, because I didn't give them the same test at time 1, but it does indicate that at least, the students learned vocabulary, whether it's translanguaging or not. So translanguaging may have a way more positive effect than using a monolingual approach. And the reason why I say this is because I unpacked the vocabulary scores, taking a look at the Learner Diaries. So here is what they said about the Learner Diaries. The first one is that translanguaging was was beneficial because it really gave students the notion to make meaning through a gradual approach. So they were able to realize that there are different ways to use language to express ideas. They were open to use these languages in the classroom, which is something that really validated their plurilingual identity. And that we can speak even with different languages in different ways. And we really need to respect this and be patient to listen to other people and understand what they really have to say. Translanguaging was also good for building an inclusive language learning community. So here we can see that the students talked about translanguaging benefiting not only himself, but also other people, because we can learn from each other. So they could learn, for example, some Spanish words from the Ecuadorian, and the Ecuadorian could also learn some words in Mandarin, for example. Now, of course, with any research, there are challenges as well, and I'm going to be highlighting some of the challenges here. The first challenge was not really with the students, but it was with the teachers. So many teachers And I don't blame the teachers because I include myself in that. I received my teacher training in a very English only approach way back when. But unfortunately, approaches are still very English only. So if you are trained in an English only approach, of course, you're going to be reproducing that English only approach. So sometimes the teachers were using the plurilingual translanguaging tasks because they were asked to do it and they trusted me. But at the same time, they would say, oh, I would catch myself saying English only, English only. And then I was like, oh, no, I can allow the students to use their languages. So, oh my goodness, what do I do? So they had that, oh, yeah, how do I juggle this? This idea that you can use English or you can't. So sometimes they felt guilty for allowing the students to use their languages, but at the same time, they trusted the process. So they could see that the students were enjoying and they were learning. So they thought, okay, let's keep doing this. And at the end, of course, when they learned about the purpose of the study, they felt really good about that because they were like, okay, that's great, because it's really reassuring that the tasks actually have a purpose. Another one was how much of the languages that the teachers can actually allow in the classroom. And I use allow here because really the students can use whatever language they want if they wish to. So it's really a way of thinking about the teacher to let go of this control, linguistic control, that it has to be English only, because the students are doing very well using their linguistic resources. So there was a little bit of a questioning to like, oh, but if my students are using Mandarin in this group and there is a student who doesn't speak Mandarin, will they be able to understand? But of course, they also saw that the students, when there was like 2 students who spoke Chinese Mandarin and another one who spoke Russian, for example, they would switch to English so that they would include. So the students were very well aware of their repertoire as well and how to use them. And of course, these are adult students. With teenagers or children, you might have to create some translanguaging spaces in the classroom. I have tons of resources if you were interested. They are all listed at the end of this presentation, but you can see a YouTube video where the teachers are talking about the experience and what they have learned with the plurilingual and translanguaging tasks. So I'll move on very quickly to study number 2, which here I'm going to mainly talk about resources and not much about the results. But this was a plurilingual shift project where we are talking about teacher training, right? That has been very monolingual. So here I introduced plurilingualism in teacher training. So there were 22 pre-service Tesol teachers here in Montreal. The teachers received teacher education in plurilingual and translanguaging practices, and they developed lesson plans. And afterwards, they taught in ESL classes here in Montreal schools. Important to mention that Montreal is a French-speaking, it's not French-speaking by policy. It's a French-speaking context, so the schools are French-speaking. So students have ESL classes in these schools. So it's almost like an EFL context. So this project was designed with my research team. So myself, John, Lana, Maria, and Jade. They're all students here at McGill, PhD and Masters. We developed plurilingual strategies, breaking them down into tutorials on YouTube. The tutorials are also available in a playlist, so you're welcome to take a look at that. So the approaches were cross-linguistic analysis, cross-cultural comparisons, translanguaging, translation for mediation, and pluriliteracies. So they were asked to watch the tutorials, and of course there were a lot of discussions in the class as well, and apply some of these strategies in their lesson plan. They received feedback, and then they went to the classroom to teach. So an example, students would create memes, use meme generator, creative use of language, creative use of images. So once again, thinking about the repertoire and different modalities. And translanguaging, students using their repertoire, talking about expressions used at the airport, for example. Here's an example in different languages. So they were free to speak in any language, and they were using their repertoire to make sense of expressions in English on Kahoot as a language game. So the main benefits that the students, and these were pre-service teachers, so they were studying to become teachers, but they did teach in the classes. So what they reported first is they were really excited about the idea of the repertoire, especially because in Montreal schools, we have a lot of students from different types of backgrounds. And they really felt that the strategies benefit all of these students. So Indigenous students, refugee students, immigrant, international status, and also French-speaking students who are locals here. There was little to no resistance by some stakeholders because the students were equipped with knowledge from research. So if somebody asked them like, oh, isn't it better to use English only? They would say, oh, not really, because of this, this, and that. So they felt that being equipped with knowledge from research really helped make a case for plurilingual and translanguaging approaches in the classroom. Now, there were challenges, of course. Some teachers were not able to convince stakeholders that a plurilingual or translanguaging approach is a better approach than monolingual. So this power relation dynamic sometimes happens. So sometimes teachers feel, oh, I cannot really, do whatever I want in the classroom because my principal doesn't allow me to do that. So one thing that we can do is to provide training not only for teachers, but also stakeholders, principals, and directors of school programs. They really need to be engaged in this type of training as well. Now, the third study is a study that I designed in Brazil. It was done online during COVID-19. There were teachers from different languages, English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. And because there were different languages, I had to come up with a multilingual team, and we're going to take a look at the team soon. The teachers received workshops on plurilingual and translanguaging practices, and they implemented 5 biweekly pluridigit tasks. Pluridigit because it's plurilingual, translanguaging, and digital at the same time. So the research team is a multilingual team. Not everybody speaks all of those languages, so we really had to combine forces here to work with the teachers. And this study was done through VoiceThread. We collaborated with pedagogical coordinators, which was something very important because once they were on board, the teachers were on board and the students were on board. So it was a perfect combination here. The tasks focus on oral comprehension, oral communication, because these students were lacking a little bit of the oral practice in class because of COVID. So sometimes teaching via Zoom, not all the students are able to, or they feel like speaking in front of everybody. So we developed this on VoiceThread because it is a tool that students can actually speak via audio and also via video. So each task had 3 steps, and they were very clearly explained to the students. The topics that we included were very critical. So it was related to racism, COVID-related issues, migration. Important to mention here that the teachers were either refugees or immigrants. So it was also important for the students who were Brazilian to understand, the issues related to immigration, migration that the teachers also go through, and sometimes students go through that as well. Each student posted audio or video and used language to discuss their own experiences in relation to their own context. The process of recording the posts really contributed to students learning the language because they knew that they had an audience. Other students are going to be listening, the teacher was going to be listening, and the research assistant. So they really felt like doing a good job. So they did a lot of, they went through a lot of processes of doing research about the topic, rehearsing before speaking. And at the end of the task, the goals were presented to them so that they could learn what they had just practiced and what they are now able to do. So instead of focusing on what students are not able to do, we decided to focus on here's what you have practiced, so you should be able to do this. Now, what were the main benefits of this one? The students, we interviewed the students, we're still finishing the analysis, but a vast majority of the students talked about confidence in speaking and becoming a speaker of English, which is very, very important for Brazilians, especially because in Brazil and in many other countries, you spend 6-7 years of school trying to learn English, and a very common sentence that they say is, oh, I just learned the verb to be in 6 years. So they really feel that they will never be able to become an English speaker. So here, by doing this task, they really felt that it helped them not only recognize themselves as an English speaker, but as a plurilingual speaker, and having this plurilingual identity, that their background was really valued and they really had something to say. And all of the teachers really liked those tasks, and they are actually using the tasks again in a second iteration, but not in a research project, but in their own teaching. And they are very excited about creating new tasks with the notion of the repertoire. So main challenges here. Main challenges, of course, encouraging students to participate in a research project during COVID-19 was not easy. The students who participated wish they had received points for participating in this research project. And some students wanted some more feedback on language use. We didn't want to provide feedback on language use, first because we are not teachers, and second because we're focusing on the repertoire. But this idea of like, oh, please give me feedback, tell me if I'm saying something right or wrong, it's also something that we need to let students know that it's not about speaking right or wrong, it's about communicating. Were you able to get the message across? If you did, well, then what's the problem, right? Now, to conclude, this idea of the repertoire is something that should be really valued, especially in this multilingual, plurilingual turn that we are going through in applied linguistics. A move from English only to including their repertoires has several benefits, as we have seen here. The challenges that we have seen are often related to the process of this change and not the pedagogy itself. So it's really important that we try to think about change as a positive process, not as a negative, because plurilingual and translanguaging approaches have several benefits. Final recommendations, of course, if you're able to work with multilingual teams to implement this shift is a best way to go, especially if you're doing research. Invite teachers, students, parents, and the community to be part of this process of change. And ideally have school stakeholders get involved in professional development again. So my final recommendation is really to work together with a lot of people who speak different languages, come from different cultural backgrounds, so that you can implement change, and change is implemented successfully. So on that note, I'm going to thank you very much. Muito obrigada, muchas gracias, merci beaucoup, to all of you, and to Ana Joaquin, who has invited me for this webinar. For more resources, you can go to Breaking the Invisible Wall and the Plurilingual Lab website, and it's all there. And here are some references. And if you're interested, I can also share the PowerPoint with you later. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Galante, Angelica Galante. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. I really liked the first study where of the 9 affordances, one of them was English language learning. right? It tends to be the focus. We don't think about the other affordances actually, but your study clearly showed of all the 8 other affordances that happen as a result of a plurilingual pedagogy, right? So I really appreciated that. And the Plurilingual Lab, I will definitely be looking into that online on the YouTube resources there. All right, so we have a few, and as you can see in the chat, people are really appreciating the presentation as well, so thank you. So we have a few minutes for some questions. If you have a question, you could please put it in the chat and I'll field them as much as possible, as much as I'm able. Okay, let's see. Let's see if there are any of them here. There are a few. Oh yes, I'd like to say actually for all those who have registered, you will be getting a link to the presentation as well. So, so if you have any questions, please go ahead, fill it in. Here's one question. Oh, actually, it's more of a comment. With young learners in an EFL let me see if I can. In the absence of systematic studies of the impact of translanguaging on linguistic attainment in specific domains, registers and genres and materials for teaching, translanguaging looks like a leap in the dark. Okay. This is in addition to the monolingual ideologies reigning in practically all nation states with young learners in an EFL context. The challenge is they may not push themselves to use the target language when they know that you as their teacher can understand and use their L1. So is there something you could speak to regarding that? Because you spoke about the teachers, now how about then from the students?
Yeah, that's something, of course, it's important, and you have to think about the type of program as well. So if we have like an EFL program, then of course students are there to learn English in the classroom. So if all of a sudden we say, yeah, you can use whatever language you want, anytime, all the time, that students may not even go there, right? So it's important. I cannot say exactly, oh, you have to use 20% of this, 10% of this, even though some people try to, oh, you can only use 10% of translanguaging in the classroom. I would never say that. I would try to investigate the context. What's the context? What are the students doing? Is it a bilingual program where they have to learn the concepts? The concepts are more important. The content is more important than the language. Which language, if it's one or another? And if it is a bilingual program, can you use both languages? But not only both, I wouldn't be restricted to both languages because many students have way more than 2 languages. In my context here in Montreal, most people, a vast majority speaks 3 or more. So why would I, just focus on 2? But of course, if the program is bilingual, the 2 languages are the focus. But I would suggest providing some spaces at least. So translanguaging spaces, plurilingual spaces, and then you negotiate that with the students. Let's get 10 minutes of each class, a 1-hour class where, you can use any language. But sometimes, some people may think about plurilingual and translanguaging approaches as actually speaking in a different language. And it's not necessarily speaking, it's actually getting the students to think about their repertoire. So many times they may still be using, let's say, English, but the process is going through different semiotic resources. So as long as they are free to think about the process, and they are encouraged to use, all the semiotic resources, then I think you are already implementing translanguaging and plurilingualism. So it doesn't really have to, my students are speaking in another language all the time. That's a problem. It may be, but it may not be. It could be that they're translanguaging, so that they can make meaning of whatever language they're learning.
Thank you. We have a question from, her hand's no longer raised, but Joan Walker, your hand is raised. Would you like to ask Angelica Galante a question?
Yes, I have a few languages. I have a few questions. I don't have a few languages. So my first question is, do teachers need to know the languages that the students are speaking?
Oh, absolutely not.
That's a good thing.
They did,
Okay.
Yeah, no. So here's something that teachers really have to think about. If the students speak a language that the teacher doesn't, that's fantastic. Let the student have the agency and the power to teach a little bit of their languages to yourself. So a lot of teachers are very comfortable with that, but the teachers who have this control, like, oh, I need to have control of my classroom, they may be a little bit more resistant to actually let the student, be the teacher for a little bit. But I would encourage teachers to really let, the student take control, not all the time, of course, but, sometimes, and let the magic happen, because it really transforms the classroom. So yeah, so you don't have to
Okay.
worry about having to speak all the languages of the students.
Good. Thank you. And have you studied this method with low-level learners? Because I noticed the learners are college level and it seems like they're advanced.
Yeah, yes, I have. Yes, in the project, the Pluridigit project, we have seen with learners different languages and different levels. English 1 level, let's say in the CFR A1, Arabic level 1, yes, and it works in any level differently, but it does work in all levels.
Okay. And then my last
Actually,
question is,
I'm-
were students using e-translators?
Oh yeah, students can use whatever they want. They can use translators, they can use, they can go on Google. We have so many digital resources. So yes, they are able to, not only able, but they can be encouraged to use any kind of software that they have available.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank
You're
you
welcome.
for your question. Algie Joy Buhai, would you like to ask a question?
Hi there. Yeah. I'm listening and I'm learning from Vietnam right now, Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. So we are using a bilingual program, and I can say that learning the language, learning the culture, and learning their dialect helps me a lot when I'm teaching them in English, because that's easier. Sorry, but I'm teaching kindergarten, so these are small kids. So it was very helpful for me to understand and talk their language, their dialect. So they understand and they learn English for me easily.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's applicable for everyone.
Yeah, sometimes we don't have to speak the language fluently, but many times I just ask my students like, oh, how do I say hello in the languages that you speak? And just by saying hello, you're just at least showing willingness to learn, right? So this is important.
Yeah.
There is a question in the chat of how do we do assessment while using translanguaging in a strict English medium instruction school?
Well, that's the $1 million question. There are a lot of researchers working on translanguaging assessment now. I can't really say much about translanguaging assessment. So as of now, of course, what I would focus on is not necessarily assessing the language, but assessing what students have to say. So, and how they say it. Of course, that the way they say it, I'm saying say, but it could be written, it could be in different modalities. I would encourage teachers to allow students to use other resources, not only the language, and if the teacher does not understand the language, let students explain in the target language of instruction, if you are able to, to have this. But yeah, but I won't comment much on that because we're still investigating assessment in a translanguaging way. Of course, if the teacher speaks the languages of the students, that's easy, but that's not always the case.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to sneak in one more question because he has been waiting patiently. Aldarma, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Good evening, good morning, good day to you all. So I'm representative from Mongolia, and so the method of diary and also the item method is really interesting, and the thing that we are doing for the medical students who learn in the English language in Mongolia And I have a question here. So why I'm doing the diary method in English, because we have not enough time for English. Maybe for the medical students, they have another basic classes, and that's why the everyday English, to enhance the English using, we doing the diary. And then I'm reading and also doing the analysis and also the item. Here's the question. So can we put in curriculum when we design the curriculum, right? So can we put that the teacher could speak in native language or in Mongolian when doing the English classes? Because the university, other maybe our bosses, the requirement that just English and English. But when you're doing the language and thinking and cultural things, we are really needed in speaking in Mongolian, explaining why here and why that. And so we put this in requirement in our curriculum, and and saying that we're using this approach or that method because we need to speak in Mongolian when we use this method.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dharma. That's a very good observation, and that's a struggle I had to go through many times as well, because I taught in Brazil, and as a Brazilian English teacher, many times they don't allow us to use Portuguese. Oh, please don't speak Portuguese in the classroom with the students. Of course, I would just do it because I know it works. And if you're going to spend 30 minutes, trying to explain something in English, where you can explain in 1 minute in the native language of the students and they get it, why wouldn't we do it, right? So of course I am in favor of doing it. Of course it will be limited somehow, especially in a foreign language context, because the students are there to learn English. But just to clarify, methods, we are so in Tesol, we are so concerned about methods that we are talking about translanguaging as a method and plurilingualism as a method. These are not methods. So we just have to understand that these are not methods. So these are theoretical constructs that have been implemented in pedagogy from a very social cultural dimension that takes the whole repertoire into consideration. Of course, for teachers, we go like, yeah, it's a theoretical concept, but what do we do in the classroom, right? So that's why we're breaking it down into strategies, for example, but these are not methods. This is a pedagogical practice. Now, as a pedagogical practice, do we include pedagogical practices in the curriculum? I don't know. I've never seen a curriculum where we say how the teacher has to teach that curriculum. So I would say that it's more a pedagogical practice that would go around the school system. That's why I insist on other stakeholders, school principals, directors of language program, to also learn about these approaches, because once they learn and they see the benefits, they are able to, tell the teaching staff, hey, you can use this pedagogical practice to enhance learning. While we cannot do this, the teacher has to see if they have the little power that they have when they close the door to actually, do this pedagogical practice in the classroom. That's what I used to do. I didn't lose my job, but we never know, right? So depending on the context, a person could even lose their job because they are using the language, of the students. So, yeah. So it's an issue. It's not an issue only for the teacher, but it's a societal issue. So we have to do better things to have a better society, so that people respect the repertoire more.
Okay, with that, I'd like to just give her a hand one more time. Thank you so much, Dr. Galante. Okay, wonderful, wonderful
Yay.
presentation, actually.
Great.
And I'd just like to say that, yes, for all those who attended, a video will be sent to you, or a link to the video will be sent to you as well, so that you can rewatch it. And I'm sure there are a lot of resources and citations that we were scrambling to write down during the presentation, so it's wonderful to have them. And just so that you know also, actually, unfortunately, we will not be giving certificates for attendance to this. Tesol has decided not to be giving certificates for any of these webinars from intersections anymore, unfortunately. So yeah, I just wanted to let you know that, okay? So with that, I just want to say thank you once again. I thank you everyone for attending. And please stay tuned for more webinars from the Applied Linguistics intersection, okay? Bye everyone.